Okay, this week's lecture is on marriage and family. The chapter is called The Changing Family. I'm going to basically just talk about sections 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3. The first section has some terminology in it. We'll talk about what marriage and family looks like in the U.S. Then section 10.2, I'll talk about, marriage and family and what the three theoretical paradigms have to say about marriage and family. So functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And then in section 10.3, we'll get back to talking about marriage and family in the U.S. with trends that have been happening for the past several decades with respect to marriage, and also problems within family situations. So trends and problems will be the last part. Okay, so let's start with the most basic term, which is family, right? So family is a group of two or more people related somehow, related by, it could be blood, marriage, or some other kind of mutual commitment, right? Also could be adoption, right? So this could mean a lot of different things depending, and it's a pretty amorphous term. We can mean a lot of different things by family, by the people we're living with, even friends and things like that. So a group of two or more people related by blood, marriage, adoption, or some kind of mutual commitment. More importantly, though, family is an institution, right? And we'll talk more about that when we get to functionalism, but we've talked before about family being an institution. It's really critical for socialization and emotional support. Another way of talking about family is as a primary group. It's kind of a smaller group where you engage in face-to-face interaction with this group over the long term, every day, right? So primary group that serves an expressive function. And what that means is that families provide an emotional support system. So expressive, emotional. Serving an expressive function means that these families provide for our emotional needs, right? Or provide an emotional support system. So family is important for lots of different things. It's an institution. It is the most basic institution for socializing people within society. It provides us with our emotional support, and it fulfills obviously all kinds of practical needs too, right? So family, the people, that institution, is responsible for all the stuff that happens at home, so that we can go out in the world and do all the other, right, productive stuff that we need to do in society. So it's kind of, as an institution, the backbone, the behind-the-scenes backbone of everything else that goes on in society. So it's a very important institution, and it has been for pretty much every society, historically speaking, right? So family, nuclear families, extended families, family is a cultural universal, right? A cultural universal, meaning we've seen some kind of family structure, typically the same nuclear family structure that we think of, but we've seen some kind of family structure in every society, right, historically speaking, around the world. Anthropologists have found different kinds of family structures. There have been, different tribal societies in which fathers were very much not involved, with raising their children or something because of how the division of labor worked. But pretty much we've all, most societies have had the same, at least nuclear family structure, and then depending on the society, sort of extended families have been more or less important. Oh, by the way, single parent families, right, have also been historically very common, right? So it's only within, the 20th century that we have, better medicine, better healthcare, much higher life expectancies, at least in our, wealthy developed nations. But before that, if you go back a century or so, it was much more common for people to become widowed, right? To lose a spouse early. And children have always been born out of wedlock and continue to be born out of wedlock. So single parent families have always been very common, and in the days of lower life expectancies were even more common than today, possibly. Sometimes marriage and family classes or the marriage and family chapters can seem somewhat conservative. And I'll talk more about this when I get to functionalism, but they're trying to, there's a sort of impetus to sort of preserve the traditional family structure of, two parents and children and things like that. But obviously this is sort of a malleable institution. And so families can be structured in different ways, and those different structures can, practically speaking, serve the same functions. The 1950s, for instance, is kind of seen as like the heyday of the American family and family values and the traditional family structure and things like that. But the 1950s was not that ideal as far as decades go. I think teen pregnancy rates in the 1950s were twice as high as they are today. Families in the 1950s were dealing with all the sorts of same problems that we are today. Alcoholism, in the 1950s there was rampant spousal abuse that no one talked about. So families changing, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And the things that we think of as ideal weren't all that ideal anyway. All right, so let's talk a little bit about marriage and family in the U.S. today. I'll have some statistics and things like that. So in the U.S. Today, marriage is still a really popular institution, right? Most adults get married. 72% of adults, meaning people age 18 and up, have been or are married. I say have been because some are divorced. So have been or are currently married. That's a lot of people, 72% of everyone over the age of 18. 56% are currently married. 10% currently divorced. And I think 6% are widowed. Right? So, and a lot of this, like, the 72% is actually lower than if you look at different age groups, right? So 18 is still really young to get married. If you go to like a middle-age group, I think in the notes I have like 45 through 54-year-olds. The percentage of people who have at least been married is 87%. Right, so it's the rate of people who have been married is even higher, depending on what age category you look at. Now this does represent even these high marriage rates. They do represent a decrease since like the mid 20th century, right? The heyday in the 50s that I was talking about. But still, obviously, a really popular institution. And we can kind of get a better understanding of what marriage looks like in the U.S. by comparing us to other developed nations, other wealthy democracies in Western Europe, Australia, Japan, things like that. And we have a sort of different culture when it comes to marriage than these other democracies have. So I'll say marriage in U.S. compared to other democracies, other developed nations, however you want to put it. The first thing is we seemingly care more about romantic relationships. We put more emphasis on romantic love as the basis for our relationship. So I'll say we emphasize romantic love versus other like practical considerations as the basis for marriage. And I actually think that gets us in trouble a little bit as far as our marriage rates and our divorce rates and things, because we have sort of a more less realistic, more whimsical take, less practical take on marriage in general. Which, I mean, for good or ill, I don't. If that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I don't need to make an evaluative statement on it. But so we have this sort of idea of romantic love, and that's why we get married and things like that. And so the U.S. has higher rates of marriage overall than these other wealthy, developed democratic nations. We have higher rates of marriage than those other nations that view marriage in a more practical way. But we'll get to number 3 here. We also have higher rates of divorce than any other nation. And I think that includes nations that are not just those wealthy democratic nations. We have the highest rates of divorce, I think, in the world right now. Okay, so putting that all together to kind of get a picture of what is happening here, we care a lot about, being in love with the person or feeling some sort of romantic connection with the person. And that makes us want to get married more frequently than people do in other places. But it also makes, I think, marriage more fragile here than in other places where it's based on practical considerations and people get into it for practical considerations and stay in the marriage for practical considerations. So we also have the highest rates of divorce than any other nation. By the way, we also have high rates of remarriage, which plays into this too. We like to get married, but we also really like to get divorced, and then we really like to get remarried, right? So we have the high rates of marriage, but also high rates of divorce and high rates of remarriage. I have been a best man in 2 weddings. Both of those people are divorced, and one of them is remarried. So, I mean, statistically speaking, that says something, right? Okay. As far as children and families in the U.S., and I'll get to more of this later when we talk about trends and problems, we still have overwhelmingly, well, not overwhelmingly, we still have most children living in two-parent households. Again, later I'll talk about single-parent households. I'll talk about cohabitation and things like that. But right now I'll just say that 70% of children live in two-parent households, and then, basically 30%, the rest, well, a small percentage within, foster system and things like that, but the rest live in single-parent households for the most part. Right? Now I should say, and I'll talk more about this later, but most of those single-parent households are female-headed, right? So the mother, or in some cases grandmother, is raising the children. But again, this is just sort of a snapshot of what marriage and family looks like in the U.S., and then we're going to get back to talking in more detail about the trends and problems with marriage and family in the U.S. Before we do that, though, I wanted to do some theory. So we'll start, as always, with functionalism, right? And remember, functionalism is the macro-level paradigm that's concerned with social stability and how the various parts of society or institutions function to maintain social stability, each of which, meeting its own needs, but then also together maintaining the structural stability of society, right? And I already said family is a really important institution, right? So family is a crucial institution. It fulfills, certain functions or needs for society, and it also, is important for maintaining societal stability. So it's a crucial institution for societal stability. And it's crucial for societal stability because it has a lot of really important functions that it performs, or needs that it meets for society, right? The first of which is socialization, right? Socialization, sorry, I should say, before I write these, I'll say functions. These are the functions of the family as an institution. The first function is socialization of children. Now, families need not have children. A lot of families don't have children. But as an institution that meets a need for society, right, this is one of the functions of family, namely for the socialization of children. That's really, really important for the functionalist because socializing children transmits, right, our culture, beliefs, norms, values, and especially those norms, telling people how to behave and what to do to be productive members of society, right, transmits our cultures and norms to the next generation, right? Family is absolutely the first agent of socialization, right? That's where we begin being socialized to be, productive or functional members of society. Without socialization, you couldn't have a society because society is sort of held together by the culture, by the rules, by the values that we share, by the beliefs that we share, right? So without socialization, you couldn't have society. So this is absolutely critical for social stability, and families, again, a very important institution. The second one, I already kind of talked about these, but the second function is the expressive function. Or meeting the emotional support needs. I'll just say emotional support, right? Meeting those emotional support needs of family members. So again, right, everything if we didn't have, family at home, right, to meet all these needs, these human, emotional, and also practical needs, right, we wouldn't be able to go out in the world and be productive. So it's the behind-the-scenes sort of backbone, serving this expressive function and other sort of practical needs on a day-to-day basis. Without that, we wouldn't be productive members of society out in the world. Okay, so those are two of the most important functions. There's a couple more, so I'll just erase these. Three is that your family regulates reproduction, right? Obviously, in our society today, sexual activity and reproduction do not always happen within the confines of marriage, right? But, or even cohabitation, right? Because we have things like Tinder and things like that. But the idea is that, traditionally as an institution, it's supposed to regulate reproduction so that you have children born into situations where they could be cared for, right, more easily. They could be socialized, etc. Again, you remember functionalism peaked in popularity in the 1950s. So, and, it's just sort of, functionalism as a paradigm is conservative, meaning functionalists want to avoid change at any cost. So even change in family structures, right, away from, say, the traditional, two-parent and children kind of structure, right? Any rapid change away from that structure, the functionalist is going to think is a bad thing, or that could lead to some kind of social instability. So that's why, if it sounds conservative, it kind of is. All right, and then finally, family provides members, or helps provide members. Family helps provide its members with, I don't know how you put it, like social identity. Something like that. So with a social identity. So what it means by family helps provide its members with a social identity, that can mean things like, ethnic identity, ethnicity, religious identity, socioeconomic identity, class, right? Class identity. So your own individual identity, as far as like a social identity, is developed, at least in part, via your family, right? Okay, so those are the major functions of family as far as the functionalist is concerned. And remember, the functionalist is going to be worried about the trends that I'll talk about later as far as like changing the family structure, because any rapid change for the functionalist could lead to social instability, and that is what the functionalist is primarily concerned with trying to avoid. Okay, now let's talk about conflict theory and the family. There's a lot of different things that conflict theory has to say about the family. And it could be problems with family as an institution itself, like inequality. Remember, the functionalist is a macro level theorist. The conflict theorist is a macro level theorist concerned primarily with inequality in society and the reproduction of inequality, right? The inequality in resources and power between some group of haves and some group of have-nots, and the haves exploit that power, right, to maintain their dominant position. Well, this can be true, between families, this kind of inequality. It can be true within families. So, first of all, between families, the conflict theorist sees family as an institution that contributes to socioeconomic inequality, right? Family as an institution contributes to, or often reproduces socioeconomic inequality, right? And this is because in the system that we have, especially, Marx is saying the capitalist system that we have, wealth tends to stay within family lines, as does poverty, right? So if you're born into a family that's struggling with poverty, you're much more likely to be experiencing poverty as an adult. If you're born into a wealthy family, you're much more likely to be wealthy as an adult and have your own wealthy family, etc., right? So wealth tends to stay in family lines. So I'll say within families, as does poverty. Poverty, right? There's a cycle of poverty. Poverty tends to stay within families. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, right? So it might not be that just the family institution or the family structure is to blame, but there are all sorts of things contributing. I mean, we had a whole chapter on socioeconomic inequality. There are all sorts of things factors contributing to socioeconomic inequality in the U.S. But when we look at that inequality, we do see that it kind of gets trapped within families. All right, so that's one observation of the conflict theorists with respect to families. That's kind of inequality between families. There's also inequality within families, right? So within the traditional family structure, we see inequality, especially gender inequality. So the traditional family structure, and by that I mean typically male breadwinners. So the old school 1950s male breadwinner, female homemaker family structure, right, was the result of and reproduced gender inequality. So men in society had all the access to employment, to resources, and to power, right? Whether that's prestige or political power, or whatever, right? Men had all the access to that because their sphere of influence was the outside world. Women had no access to that under this traditional family situation or this traditional family division of labor because they were homemakers and they didn't have any access to the outside world. So you have men enjoying pretty much all of the power and resources in society, being a dominant group in society. Women not having the access to the power and resources in society, being a subordinate group. The family structure was set up this way because men were a dominant group, but also it obviously caused and reproduced inequality as well, right? So just the family structure itself, a huge factor in contributing to gender inequality, right? Family as an institution contributing to gender inequality within society. Some other observations from the conflict theorists, kind of contrary to what the functionalist says, families are not always a source of emotional support. They don't always fulfill that expressive function. So families are not always a source of emotional support. I'll just say not always a source of support. Families can be, we know, dysfunctional, right? And I'll get to problems with families in a bit, but, horrible stuff like spousal abuse, child abuse, things like that, neglect. So families can well, not often, but families can sometimes be, dysfunctional and cause all sorts of problems for the people that are in those families, and also that kind of has a ripple effect and causes problems for society in general. And then finally, the conflict theorist says many of the problems that families face today not only contribute to inequality in the way that like the gendered family structure contributes to inequality, but are actually just caused by inequality. So many of today's family problems stem from things like socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality, etc. Right? And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about single parent households and things like that. But a lot of problems within families can stem from socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality. A lot of abuse problems within families. Family violence stems from the patriarchy, from gender inequality, etc. So these the family not only contributes to some of this inequality, but it's also its own problems are caused by other inequalities with respect to other institutions in society, and institutional sexism and institutional racism, etc. I think that's all I wanted to say as far as conflict theory. So the last paradigm is the micro-level paradigm, symbolic interactionism. Right, micro-level paradigm, concerned with meaning exchange and micro-level or individual interactions. So obviously the symbolic interactionist is going to be concerned with micro-level interactions that happen within families, right, between family members. A couple of terms that come out of symbolic interactionism with respect to family are, one is negotiated meanings. And what this means is that a lot of problems within, right, at the micro level within families, and this is especially true of marriages, are the result of misunderstandings, or you could say differences between family members with respect to things like perceptions, right? Understandings, expectations is a big one. I already used the word understanding, so I'll say expectations, right? So, in other words, at the micro level within families, we often have to negotiate over meanings, especially in marriage, right? Because two people come into marriage with different beliefs, values, ideas of norms. Sometimes they have different perceptions of the same situation, right? Or they have different expectations for what the roles are for each member within the marriage or within the family. And so a lot of problems arise because of that. And what that involves is having to negotiate meanings, meaning having to, at the micro level, get everybody on the same page as far as the meaning exchanged and the way that situations are perceived and the understanding of perceptions. The understanding of expectations. So that's one kind of concept that comes out of symbolic interactionists. discussion of marriage and family. Another concept we could talk about is like ritualized activities. So there's a lot of ritualized activity as far as micro level, family interactions. And that just basically means ritualized ways that families interact or spend time together, right? And those can be day to day, right? Where people eat dinner, whether they eat in front of the TV or at the table, or when, and these kinds of activities that you engage in sort of a ritualized way with your family every day. But it could also be like things like how the family celebrates birthdays or holidays or something like that, right? That's also ritualized activities. And that's, interesting and worth studying at the micro level, the differences between people. As far as like these kind of micro level concepts, negotiated meanings and ritualized activity, most sitcoms about American families deal with this stuff, right? It's weird to see a sitcom as like educational or having anything to say to inform us, but really they're very good. Sitcom writers are very good at sort of pulling apart what happens within families, especially the negotiated meaning stuff, and also portraying the ritual activities of families. Okay, that's it for the 3 theoretical paradigms. I want to move on now. Let's see how much time we've got. All right. Not that I have a time limit. I'm just trying to keep it reasonable. All right, let's talk about some trends and problems now. So I'll start with trends. And even these trends could be seen as problematic. Some of them could be anyway. So one major trend in marriage and family that's been happening for a while and continues to happen is the popularity of cohabitation, right? Cohabitation is one of the major trends in U.S. Families, right? So that just means people living together, right, without being married. So living with a romantic partner without being married. Remember how I said marriage is really popular in the U.S. and it's based on this idea of romantic love, kind of an ideal of romantic love. Cohabitation is the exact same thing. We not only like to get married in the U.S., we really like to live together with our romantic partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever, right? And we kind of do this, the same way that we do like serial marriage and getting married and getting divorced and getting remarried. We do serial dating and serial cohabitation where couples cohabitate for a little while and then they get a different, they break up and get in a different relationship. So that's also kind of a trend that sort of mirrors the marriage trend. The average cohabitation lasts 2 years, right? So 2 years, but only 2 years. And then half of those cohabitations, or half of those cohabitating couples or cohabiting couples, however you want to say it, break up, right, and move out, and then half get married. So sometimes, or half the time, cohabitation ends because it's defined as not being married and the people get married. But the other half of the time, people break up, and then you see that trend of re-cohabitation with someone else. As far as couples that live together without being married, 45% of those have children. They could be their own children, the biological children of that couple. They could be a child from a previous relationship. I don't have the actual breakdown statistically, but I can say that 45% of people living in these cohabitating situations have children living with them. All right, the last thing I'll say about cohabitation is kind of counterintuitive. But living together before marriage actually makes divorce a little more likely, right? So you would think that living together before marriage would make divorce less likely because you've already sort of lived with the person and you know what to expect. So there won't be any major surprises. But counterintuitively, couples who live together before they're married are more likely to get divorced. What might explain this is that couples who are willing to live together before marriage have a looser view of marriage norms. Couples who are absolutely not willing to live together before they get married have a more conservative or rigid view of marriage norms, and then so probably have more negative attitudes towards divorce, right? Because they have these more rigid or traditional views about marriage than couples who live together. So that might explain why that is the case. Another trend as far as marriage and family is postponing marriage. This is not surprising, right? We get married later than people used to. Postponing marriage. We get married later than people used to, years later now than people used to a few decades ago. But it's relatively straightforward as far as explaining this because, more often now people go to graduate school, right? The way the economy is, it's very difficult to become financially established. You could be, well into your 30s before you're able to buy a house. People are, adults are living with their parents into their 20s now because of this economic situation. So it takes longer and it's harder to become financially established, and that means people are just putting off getting married and having kids for a while, if not in some cases, just indefinitely. All right. So I already talked a little bit about divorce. But that's another trend, the increasing divorce rate. We have the highest divorce rate in the world. In the U.S. right now, it's somewhere between 40 and 50% of marriages end in divorce. So nearly half of marriages will end in divorce. But like I said, people also like to get remarried and then divorced again and remarried or whatever, right? So we do have a really high divorce rate, and this divorce rate began to rise in the 1960s and 70s, right? So I will say we had a not as high as today, but we had a higher divorce rate during the Depression and World War II because of economic hardship and war, but that fell, right, sharply in the 1950s. So we had this really low divorce rate in the 1950s, and then after the 50s we see the increase, especially in the 1960s and 70s, to the point, to the divorce rate that we're at today. So why has the divorce rate increased since the 50s? So why the rise in divorce rates? There are a bunch of explanations. Sometimes people blame, the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s for sort of pushing women to be independent from men, but I don't think it's really the women's movement. definitely women becoming more economically independent in the 60s and 70s is one of the factors. So women become more economically independent in 60s and 70s, right? Women get into the workforce en masse in the 60s and 70s. Why? Because before that, they didn't have access to employment, right? They had to fight for their rights to be employed. And so when they become employed, they're more financially independent, right? It was very difficult in the 1950s for women to get divorced because they didn't have any access to employment. They had no way of financially supporting themselves because of a sexist society. And so by the 1960s and 70s, when women can work, they at least have some way of financially supporting themselves. And so it's more viable to not be in the marriage anymore, right, to get divorced. So that's one factor. Another factor is just like the social disapproval of divorce decreases. Right, the 1960s was an era of upheaval as far as our cultural norms and values, all right, our traditional cultural norms and values, and you saw a decrease, over the decades after the 1950s of the social disapproval of divorce. Today, it's fully, common and acceptable, but back in the 50s it wasn't. So that kind of social disapproval prevented some people from getting divorces, and so once you get rid of that, or it starts to assuage, you get more divorces. Here's the big one, and I think this probably accounts for most of the increased divorce rate we see in the 1960s and 70s and the high rate of divorce today. A change in one institution always affects a change in the other institution, and this, what I'm about to talk about, is a change in our legislation, right, our laws. So what happened in the decades following the 1950s was that divorce became much easier to obtain legally. Divorce became easier to get, legally speaking. Right? So by the 1980s, most, if not all, states had what's called no-fault divorce laws, right? Which basically means a couple can cite irreconcilable differences and they're granted a divorce. Not a lot of questions asked. It's a lot easier. I think you can do a lot of it online now, right? It's pretty simple, and it's not as expensive. But if you go back to a time before we had these no-fault divorce laws in most states, so if you go back to the 1950s before a lot of these laws existed, basically divorce was a really drawn-out, expensive process in which one spouse had to prove that the other spouse was unfit to be married to. This was a difficult process. It was hard to do. It was messy, etc. So that it used to be really hard to get a divorce, legally speaking. Now it's not. So obviously there are going to be more divorces. Okay, so another trend, this rise in divorce rates has contributed to, and cohabitation, by the way, the other trend, right? Those things have contributed to a high number, a rise in single-parent households. So for decades, the number of single-parent households has also risen somewhat, right? So number of single-parent households has risen. Now this wouldn't necessarily be problematic in itself, but unfortunately um, you know, the median income for these single parent households is a lot less than the median income for two parent households. Why? Because when you have two people, you have the ability to compile resources, right? You have two people earning a paycheck. When you don't have two people, you only have one person earning a paycheck, right? If you have two people and one loses a job, right, you still have money coming in. That's not true if you just have one person. You get it. It's pretty obvious, right? So single parent households have a much lower median income. Much lower median income, higher poverty rates. And like I said earlier, most single parent households are female headed, right? So, this is also a problem, especially since we still have a wage gap in our society, right? Where women only earn about 82% of what men do, right? And then we also have this situation where most single parent households are female headed. So most are female headed, which means that this economic problem falls on these female headed households, and 32% of these female headed single parent households fall below the poverty line, or poor, right? Because of the wage gap and things like that, this isn't as true for male-headed households. I think only 16% of male-headed households are poor, but that's still higher than the rate of poverty for two-parent households, which is something like 6%, right? So anytime you have a single-parent household, you're at greater risk of poverty, but female-headed single-parent households are about twice the risk of poverty than male-headed, right? I think the book talks about race and ethnicity with respect to single-parent households. So you see a lot of female-headed single-parent households in like African-American communities, for instance. But if you look at this situation, like if you look at the situation that African-American families have faced for decades, you might kind of make sense of the fact that there are so many female-headed single-parent households, right, within African-American communities, because all African-Americans were subject to different forms of, institutional racism, institutions that aren't the family. We're talking about, employment discrimination. So you could think about decades of, especially African-American men, right, being subject to employment discrimination, being subject to housing discrimination, not being able to buy houses that would accrue equity, not to mention institutional racism in the criminal justice system, making it very difficult for those men, right, to be involved in caring for families. And so that creates a situation where you have more female-headed single-parent households, but it also creates a situation where culturally it's more normal, right, to have female-headed single-parent households. Okay. Let's talk about some problems, right? So those were trends in family, marriage and family, but they weren't necessarily all that problematic. So more obvious problems as far as families are concerned, the biggest would be family violence, right? And we could kind of break that down in a couple ways. We could talk about violence against intimates, which kind of encompasses a lot of the different kind of violence we think of. So, domestic violence, this is violence against spouses, like, cohabitating, we'll say live-in partners, violence against boyfriends and girlfriends that don't live together. Right, etc. So family violence includes this violence against intimates, right? This kind of domestic violence, spousal abuse. And then it also includes child abuse, right? Violence against children. So, sorry, some depressing topics and even more depressing statistics. Let's start with this violence against intimates, right? Or I could even talk about family violence in general for a minute. Unfortunately, family violence, whether you're talking about violence against intimate or whether you're talking about violence against children, about child abuse, we as a society, right, did not perceive family violence to be a social problem until as recently as, the 60s or 70s, really the 70s. So, remember I talked at the very beginning of the semester about each social problem having two components. There's the objective component, right, the actual negative outcomes that are measurable. This has always been a problem and is a problem for every society, and historically has always been a problem, right? Family violence. But it's been hard to measure. But there's always been that objective problem. But the subjective component is when society perceives something to be a problem. And unfortunately, society didn't really perceive this to be a problem, like I said, until the 60s and 70s. We started, I think, medical professionals, the police and stuff started to notice things in maybe as far back as the 50s as far as like child abuse and stuff. But it was kind of like the idea was what happened behind closed doors within a family was nobody else's business. It wasn't the business of the public or society. So unfortunately we only start to really become aware of the issue and talk about it, only, a few decades ago. But, objectively, it's a big problem. The National Crime Victimization Survey estimates that, there's, so upwards of 500,000 cases of intimate, right, this violence against intimates, every year, right? 80% of those cases of violence against intimate are perpetrated by men against women. So I'll say 80% are committed by men, right? And most of those, cases of violence happen obviously within a relationship. And I think a study in 1998 found that 22% of women report being assaulted in some way physically by an intimate partner at least once in their lifetime, right? So this is a huge problem in society and continues to be, right? I guess when we talk about violence against intimates, the biggest problem with the discourse, right, is dispelling the kind of perennial question that people ask, which is why doesn't the person just leave, right? If a woman is being, for instance, physically assaulted or abused by a husband or boyfriend or whatever, why not just leave? And the reality is that many do leave, and a lot of them leave, but it can be really dangerous to leave. And there's a lot of manipulation that goes on within these situations. So sometimes children are used as pawns and threatened, and so people don't want to leave because they're worried for the sake of their children, right? And leaving can be incredibly dangerous, right? Even, lead to mortal danger for the person leaving. And there's not enough support system for people that are in these situations, right? We do have shelters and things, but those shelters, typically you can only stay for a couple of weeks, and they're overcrowded and things like that. So the reason is why not just leave is that just leaving minimizes how difficult it is. Like the idea of just leave, that minimizes how difficult it is to leave and how absolutely dangerous it can be to leave. Okay, and then finally, some stats for child abuse. Sorry to end on such a depressing note, but physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, things like that. I think it's the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services estimates that there are around 800,000 cases of child abuse and neglect each year. And most of those cases are perpetrated by parents and step-parents. And this is problematic, not only for the children being abused, obviously, but as children grow up, they're much more likely to face, developmental problems, psychological problems, behavioral problems if they suffer from, some kinds of neglect and abuse as children. Okay, so that's it for Chapter 13 on marriage and family. Next week we are doing, I can't remember what chapter number it is, but we're doing the chapter on war and terrorism. I'll see you then.